Live button, and I think we're going to be live on Facebook today. Yesterday we had a little bit of a problem there because they didn't like the content. They didn't like the topics of the show, so Facebook said we were not in accordance with their community guidelines, but I think it's going to work today. Let's give it a second. It looks like we're online, so let's get started. Hello, my friends, and welcome back to yet another episode of Watching the Watchers Live. My name is Robert Gruler. I am a criminal defense attorney here at the R&R Law Group in the always beautiful and sunny Scottsdale, Arizona, where my team and I, over the course of many years, have represented thousands of good people facing criminal charges. And throughout our time in practice, we have seen a lot of problems with our justice system. I'm talking about misconduct involving the police. We have prosecutors behaving poorly. We have judges not particularly interested in a little thing called justice. And it all starts with the politicians, the people at the top, the ones who write the rules and pass the laws that they expect you and I to follow, but sometimes have a little bit of difficulty doing so themselves. And so that's why we started this show called Watching the Watchers, so that together, with your help, we can shine that big, beautiful spotlight of accountability and transparency back down upon our very system, with the hope of encouraging some meaningful change. We're grateful that you are here and with us today. Of course, we're going to be diving into a lot. We've got impeachment party Day 3. The Democrats wrapped up their case in chief this afternoon, and so they're done. Tomorrow, Donald Trump is going to be, his defense team is going to be presenting their case, and so we're going to talk a little bit about both sides. We're going to talk about what the Democrats did today, like we talked about yesterday. I'm going to go through the good and the bad, and we're going to run through sort of the flow chart that we've been working off of for the last couple days, and we're going to tease out what they did. And I thought some of it was very good, and some of it was, kind of to be expected in terms of what you would expect a criticism would be for a political show trial. So we're going to go through all of that. Then we're going to change gears just a little bit. Of course, a lot of this impeachment stuff is related to the Capitol Hill riots, the protests that took place. And we now know a little bit more information, or actually we know that we don't know more information about Officer Brian Sicknick, the Capitol Hill police officer who died shortly after the Capitol Hill riots. And you got to be careful about what you're saying about that now, because originally the story was he was murdered by these Capitol Hill rioters, but now more and more information is coming out. Maybe that is not exactly the case. They're still trying to piece that together. So we're going to break that down a little bit. Got some good links, some good stories we're going to cover there. And then lastly, to close out the program, our last segment is going to be about Derek Chauvin. Derek Chauvin is the officer who was involved, who murdered George Floyd back in the summer of last year, 2020. A lot of activity on his case, and I mean a lot of it. He's scheduled for trial in March. A whole slew of documents have been submitted over these last few days, and I want to show you what those look like. And we'll run through a couple of them. They're called motions in limine, which I don't think we've spent a lot of time on this channel talking about. But basically, those are motions that allow one side or the other to craft some of the evidence that is able to come into court. And so the prosecutor's office, the government, which is prosecuting this police officer, they filed just a slew of motions, I think 7 different motions in limine. So we're going to go through some of those as well as we get into the official legal documents. Before we jump into everything, I want to thank you for being here, of course. I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel. This is when we go live every weekday, and we're going to have a little bit of another special, I think, Digital Bill of Rights session on Saturday at the same time. So we want to make sure that you're available for that. So a subscribe, a like, a comment down below would be very helpful to us as we're trying to grow the channel. We are also going to go through some slides, and the slides will be available over on a separate platform called Locals. So if you want to get a copy of the slides that I'm about to go through, those are available. The address is watchingthewatchers.locals.com or locals.com/watchingthewatchers, whichever you prefer. The link is in the description below. You can head on over there. We're also going to take questions from the live chat that Miss Faith and Mr. Ma, our outstanding team here, that they are moderating over there. So head over to Locals and check us out there. All right, so let's get into it. As I mentioned, I wanted to start with the impeachment proceedings. Today was day 3 of the impeachment. The Democrats presented their case in chief, and they're done. So the way that the rules were set up for this entire trial was the Democrats were going to have about 16 hours to present their case. the Republicans, or not the Republicans, but really Trump, has 16 hours to present his case. And so yesterday we had a lot of testimony from a number of different House impeachment managers in the Senate. These were House representatives. And today they sort of wrapped up early and they were done. They fleshed out their entire case. They talked about a lot of different things. We didn't hear anything from Trump or his team. So today is really just kind of a critique or compliments for what the Democrats did in the quote trial, in the quote court today. So I want to go through some of the good, some of the bad. Then we'll take a look at some of the specific language and some of the testimony that was given by these House managers. And then you can see whether or not they match up with sort of my conclusion. So let's start with some of the good stuff. Like we talked about yesterday, the Democrats have been doing a good job on this, in my opinion, just because of their persuasion techniques. Now, a lot of these persuasion techniques, I think, are somewhat obvious, but they're using them effectively. And you're going to see today there was a lot of this called thinking past the sale. And so, this is a concept that we'll talk a lot about. I think I even have a slide here where I'll explain what that was. But the Democrats were just sort of talking like Trump has already been convicted. They're saying, we have to do this, or, this is going to be done so this does not happen again. And you're saying, well, what do you mean again? Have you proved that it happened the first time? Or are you just talking about preventing this from happening again and Donald Trump being responsible for it? So they're sort of talking like it's already been determined that Donald Trump was responsible for inciting the quote insurrection. So a lot of good technique there, stuff that I don't think necessarily would fly in court, in a real court, but it was a good technique. And as I'm going through this, keep this in mind. I'm a criminal defense attorney. I'm used to practicing in a real court with real rules of evidence and real rules of procedure. And there really wasn't much of that in this proceeding. And so when I'm I'm holding a lot of the Democrats to those standards because I think those standards are important. Due process, confrontation clause, the ability to present evidence, the ability to limit the scope of the evidence to only stuff that is relevant and pertinent to the final issue. And so those are the things that I think are important for a legitimate trial, for a legitimate procedure. And those aren't really the same rules that take place in the Senate. And the way that they were presenting their case was in conformity with their rules, not with the standard traditional rules that you would see in an ordinary court of law. It was sort of a political set of rules that they had an agreement with the Republicans before the trial started. And so they were adhering to their rules. And I'm a big fan of people playing to the rules, right? If they set the rules, they know what they are, they should use them to their maximum advantage. And they did that. Now, those rules, in my opinion, were not necessarily in conformity with what you would expect from a legitimate trial, but that's okay, because it's their rules and they're playing to those rules. So, when you hear those types of critiques, just keep that in mind. They were adhering to the rules very, very nicely, and they were exploiting them for maximum advantage, which is a good thing if you want to win a case. They were also doing a lot of this emotional appeal stuff. We had this from yesterday, a lot of emotional appeals. They sort of shifted the narrative from this was really bad to this is still bad. This is an ongoing threat. This is something we're going to see more and more of. They were referencing some Capitol Hill reports from other law enforcement agencies that came out, I think, on the 13th of January, about a week after the January 6th riots. And they were using this report to say, this is still ongoing. We still have this continuing threat that we have to address. And the only way we can do that is by convicting Donald Trump. So even though, that's sort of outside the scope of why they're there, they're trying to determine, in my opinion, whether or not Donald Trump was actually responsible for the original incitement. Now they're sort of saying, well, we have to punish him so that this does not happen again, which is effective, right? I think it's totally outside the scope, but it's effective, and they did a lot of that today. They also use what I call the high ground maneuver. Actually, I didn't invent that. This is something that a lot of people call the high ground maneuver, where they talked a lot about the world stage. So they were sort of taking this out of the weeds a little bit. Traditionally, of course, in politics, especially in America, it's the Republicans are bad, the Democrats are bad, the Republicans are good, the Democrats are good, and they're both sort of at each other's throats. And poor libertarians, nobody cares about them. But, the point is, it's just very localized, and they're very aggressive and sort of in the weeds. You said this, no, you said that. And it's sort of stuff that a lot of people just consider to be political bickering or a lot of political noise. The country has a lot of problems. People are expecting our politicians to be focused on some of the real issues, but of course they're not. They're focused on the bickering minutia that a lot of us sort of, want to claw our earballs off, eyeballs out and ears off because of just how monotonous it can be. So the Democrats today sort of pulled it out of those weeds a little bit. They said, listen, our foreign enemies are going to be looking at how we're governing ourselves here, and they're going to sort of see this as an opening, an opportunity to come in and cause some other malfeasance in our country. But also think about our allies. The people around the world look to us with reverence as Americans, and they think that the United States has due process and civility, and we're leaders of the world. And so if we don't impugn Donald Trump, if we don't hold him accountable, then that means that we're failing the world, right? And that's a big ask. So you're taking the high ground on this while everybody else is bickering about due process and cross-examinations and those types of things. They're saying we're leaders on a world stage. And so it's persuasive. It's stuff that I think a lot of people will resonate with. In terms of the public, senators, it's a foregone conclusion. I don't think that they're going to vote to convict Trump no matter what. But this isn't really for that purpose. It's kind of a public spectacle. They're trying to get a lot of mileage out of the January 6th riots, and this is a good and effective way to do that. They also touched on, I'm going to give them some credit for this, they actually did touch on some due process arguments and some First Amendment arguments. So you're going to see there was a rebuttal from Ted Lieu and Joe Neguse, who were sort of doing a pre-buttal for Donald Trump. So they know that his defense lawyers will be out tomorrow, and they were already rebutting some of their claims that they're expected to make. So I think that's a good technique. And then yesterday, or same issue as yesterday, very good pacing and good energy like yesterday. A lot of the speakers were, time was kept, was appropriate. They didn't ramble on for too long. Good pace, changed them up pretty quickly. And it was just sort of it's a lot of the same faces that we saw yesterday, but sort of a good rotation, and it kept people's attention, and it was a lot of information. So if you were interested in it and this was sort of your side, you probably enjoyed it. Now, some of the bad stuff. Okay, now this is some of the same things that we talked about yesterday. There were a lot of personal stories here, a lot. And I thought that they were very overly duplicative. We've already heard about this. They spent basically all day yesterday talking about how horrendous this whole situation was. And we got that point. Like, that point has been beaten into the ground. It's been beaten to death. They've showed videos and images and news article after news article and online post. We get it, right? We get it. And in my mind, this is missing the mark pretty dramatically. And I'll show you that based on the flow chart that we were discussing yesterday and the day prior to that. But basically, in my opinion, the crux of their case should have been more about causation. Donald Trump said something, and that was directly responsible for the Capitol Hill riots. And a lot of that, in my take on this, it just wasn't there. They were sort of doing an end run around a lot of the issues that I think are legally important, and they were going from Donald Trump said a bad thing to this bad thing happened, and that's kind of it. And so they're subverting a lot of the process and procedure that you would see in a traditional legal proceeding. They also really expanded the scope today. So sort of this is converse to what we were talking about the world stage, right? And calling this an ongoing threat. Those are really outside the scope of what we were supposed to be doing here if we're trying to dial in and get down to whether or not Donald Trump was responsible for this stuff. So I said the scope expanded to include the entire world. Now we're thinking about the whole world now. We're thinking about continuing threats. We're talking about post-incitement. So they spent some time today talking about what Donald Trump was doing after the Capitol Hill riot took place. And then they also were talking about penalties. Okay, so a lot of penalties. And that's just, that's kind of a whole separate phase in a case, in a criminal case, in a criminal court of law. When you have a trial, you're talking about whether or not a person was guilty of committing that crime. You don't talk about the sentencing. The sentencing is a different part of the case. So let's say, okay, you go on a trial. Somebody gets, found guilty, let's say, for murder. You don't talk about what the penalty is, whether it's 25 to life or the death penalty or 10 years or 15 years for a manslaughter or whatever that looks like. You don't talk about that. That's for a whole different proceeding. That's for sentencing. You just talk about the facts of the case. Did that person murder that other person? And anything that's beyond that question is outside the scope. And so, you would never in a criminal trial talk about, essentially what a neighboring state would do if your client is found innocent, right? If we find this person not guilty of murder, well, then people in New Mexico are just going to start murdering people. They're going to feel the consequences of this outcome here today, right? The judge would be like, what the hell are you talking about? That's totally irrelevant. All right. The question here is, on this date, location, time, in this facility, did this happen? and anything else is sort of extraneous. It's not part of the underlying issue. And so the scope in this proceeding was just massively blown out of proportion, which was expected, right? There's nobody in there objecting, saying, well, that's not relevant, that's outside the scope, that's beyond the issue. They're just saying, okay, well, they get 16 hours. They can go in there and talk about whatever the hell they want. And they were using that to full effect, which is why I gave them points for thinking past the sale and trying to effectuate the high ground maneuver by lifting up the debate onto the world stage. They also, in my opinion, if you've been on this channel for some period of time, you've heard me be very, I would say, in favor of strong First Amendment protections. And when they were doing their pre-buttal, even though they mentioned the First Amendment, they sort of did it in a way saying, well, it's not that important. So I considered that to be a watering down of the First Amendment. I do not like the fact that that is precedent now. I don't like the fact that the House representatives in an official proceeding on the floor of the Senate were talking about how the First Amendment is kind of not really applicable here. I thought that was kind of dangerous precedent. I don't even like the idea that argument is being made, but it's being made. And so I gave them a bad on that. Same type of thing with the due process stuff. So you're going to hear, I'm already seeing this stuff around Twitter, little understanding of due process. Okay. So they're talking a lot about, well, this was, Trump had all the due process that he's entitled to. He had this thing and we voted on it while he was still here and he had a chance to participate in his defense and all this stuff. And you're thinking, wait a minute, come on. Like, we all know that is total BS, right? If you have a judge who's also a Democrat, who's a witness, and is somebody who's going to be voting as a juror, that's not even close to due process, right? That's not even resembling it. But they are, because it's a biased judge. It's completely biased, right? It'd be like us taking a case into court and the police officer who cited our client is also going to be the judge and was a witness to the arrest and then is going to vote as to whether or not our client is guilty. You're going, what? That's... Due process is supposed to create some protections for the defendant who's going through the mechanisms of the justice system. And here, the whole thing was just kind of a joke. So they touched on due process a little bit, sort of in passing, just to pre-butt Donald Trump's argument. But I mean, if you just look at it objectively, a lot of the same elements that you would find in a regular criminal trial that would protect due process just were not prevalent here. And I understand what they were doing. They have to address it because Trump's team is going to bring it up tomorrow, but it's a little bit of a stretch. I would say it's a big bit of a stretch. And then lastly, I already sort of touched on this, but they were focused on the consequences and not on the criminality. So again, the effects. They were focused on the effects of the Capitol Hill riots without ever really getting to the answer or making, in my opinion, what would be a very solid case that would justify talking about the effects, because they didn't connect the dots. They didn't connect that Donald Trump was ultimately responsible for the incitement and the damage. They just sort of talked about the damage and the consequences and just said, well, Donald Trump was there, so he's responsible for it, without making that causal connection. Now, I did spend some time watching it today, in and out of it, but apparently a lot of senators were not doing that. So I wanted to just call this to your attention. The Wall Street Journal, the senators show signs of fading as the impeachment trial continues. So as the third day of the impeachment trial continued, some senators appear to be run down by the long days. Many were hunched over their desks, leaning back. At one point, Bernie Sanders hung his head and appeared to be resting. John Thune, a Republican, switched between taking notes, playing with his pen, and picking his fingernails. We got Rick Scott writing on a blank map of Asia. He had studied what appeared to be a map of Southeast Asia during yesterday's proceedings as well. So maybe he's taking a trip over there. Handful of Republican senators chatted during the presentations. During video of the Michigan protest, Ben Sass of Nebraska, Tim Scott of South Carolina, they chatted briefly. We got Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, Kevin Kramer of North Dakota. They also were talking. As impeachment manager, Jamie Raskin was speaking. So basically the point of this article is saying that they weren't paying attention, right? Senator Kramer, Senator Toomey exchanged a few words and appeared to laugh. Many senators on both sides took notes much of the time. We got Bill Cassidy, one senator who changed his vote Monday night, sided with all the Democrats and 5 Republicans in saying the trial was constitutional, wrote furiously on a notepad. So Mr. Cassidy has said his mind is not yet made up on the final vote. By about 2 p.m., there were 15 Republicans missing from the chamber. And I'm already seeing on Twitter, people are just outraged about this. Well, if they weren't there, if you're a juror in a criminal trial, you can't get up and leave the jury box and you can't do all this stuff. Therefore, they should not count. We should just take those 15 Republicans, throw them out of the final vote, and just have a vote with the actual quorum, which the people who were there and observed the whole thing. And I just think it's hysterical now that a lot of the political commentators are now sort of invoking some of the same criminal procedures that you would expect in a criminal case. Well, if you're in a criminal case, you can't leave. You can't have the jury can't leave. And you say, well, I know, but in a criminal case, you wouldn't have a police officer as the judge and the juror also, right? So let's just take it easy on this stuff, okay? The whole thing is not following traditional procedures that you would find in any other real court of law in this country that I've ever been to, okay? Maybe that's not true. There's one up here in I'm not going to call the name of it, but it's very, very far out on the outskirts where it's kind of a wacko land out there. So we'll just leave that be, but it's not the right way to run things. And so to see a lot of these, armchair lawyers now coming out and saying, this is just egregious, they should be thrown out of the proceedings. I'm going, do you really think that the rest of this was by the book? Do you really think that this was a brilliant presentation that is in comportment with the rest of what we think is valuable in a lawful due process heavy criminal proceeding? It's not even close to that. We have articles from CNN that are being introduced as evidence. We've got tweets, we've got posts from the Donald.win that are being introduced. I mean, the whole thing is just like laughable. But now they want to go back to the rules. So we're going to see a lot of that. You're going to see both sides making a bunch of stuff about the final outcome. They're just, they're doing what they can to win it in the face of knowing that the Republicans are just not going to convict him basically no matter what. So, all right. So once again, this is the flow chart that we've been working through. Jurisdiction, we talked about that. I think that was on Tuesday. Then, in my opinion, if I were prosecuting this case, I would want to, first and foremost, make sure that we have incitement buttoned down, that Donald Trump did something that overcomes the Brandenburg test that led to the insurrection, and that insurrection could not be defended by political speech. The reds are the defense sort of stop signs. Then we have formal causation. Donald Trump would not be able to work his way out of causation because he would, as a prosecutor, you would be able to show that he was the direct cause. There was no intervening cause. There was no superseding cause. And that cause, so basically his words from the incitement that led to the insurrection that caused the interference with the government could not be attributed to negligence on behalf of the government. And then that would lead to a final verdict. So we've talked about that a few times. Now today, we sort of skipped over almost all of this. Today was a lot about sort of jumping from, as I mentioned, the riot attack, so the harm, or the look at that, that's just brutal right there. So the harm, the Capitol Hill riots, we sort of bypassed a lot of this stuff today. We touched a little bit on free speech here. We talked a little bit about political speech, but most of this was sort of just going around. We weren't even really focused on the verdict. We were kind of focused on everything that happens after the verdict, right? So we talked a lot about what the world thought and our allies and everybody else, and just how damaging this is going to be to America on a world stage. And we kind of glossed over a lot of this other stuff today. Now, some of it we did cover yesterday. We kind of ran through it, but it was sort of an end run around what I would consider to be a formal due process-ish proceeding, but those are the rules. So they're allowed to do that. As I mentioned, there's nobody there to hold them accountable to that. They just say, okay, just do whatever you want. You got 8 hours. That's why the Republicans were just sort of, okay, we've had enough. We've seen enough of this stuff. So that was what the process looked like to me. As I mentioned, the scope here was also massively expanded. This was the original scope that we saw in the article of impeachment. The only thing that we saw in those 5 pages of documents were false statements. We won by a landslide was the statement that Donald Trump made that they weren't happy with. If you don't have a country, you're not going to be able to, if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. And then we had the Raffensperger phone call. And previously, there were a lot of other issues that were outside of the scope that they did not bring in. Things like anything Donald Trump Jr. said, things Rudy Giuliani said, things Cindy Powell said. We talked about this yesterday. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But then when we saw the Democrats' memorandum come out, all of these external issues were now lumped into the same issues. So they went inside the blue circle, and they were talking about it. They talked about a lot of these things. We saw this sort of on parade yesterday. Now, today, more issues came up. We talked about Russia, China, Iran, this concept here that Trump will do it again, and that our allies care, and what the world thinks is important, and all of those other things. And so even the scope that was yesterday, these are new issues that were outside of the memorandum, and today those were all inside. So they brought the Russia, China, Iran stuff in, the Trump will do it again stuff, the dangerous MAGA people. We have our allies care, and we've got what the world thinks. So the scope just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's good moving. It's nice work, Democrats. Well done, right? I mean, they can just continue to do that. All of those external issues would have been laughed out of court in a regular court proceeding, unless they were particularly relevant to the issue at hand, but most of them are not. Okay, what China, Russia, and Iran think about the Capitol Hill riots is irrelevant, in my opinion, to what actually happened and whether or not Donald Trump was responsible for it. So let's get into the actual proceeding. Spent a lot of time on that, but it says here at 11:18 a.m. today, Rep. Raskin said, "We'll have no one to blame but ourselves if Trump is reelected and incites further violence." So this is good, right? This is thinking past the sale. He's saying, this is going to happen again. He already incited one set of violence, and so if we don't act now, he's going to incite further violence. Okay, it hasn't been proven yet, because he has not been convicted, that he actually incited the first incident. But he's already talking about preventing the next one. It's called thinking past the sale. The analogy that I've heard used a few times is when you go and you buy a car at a car dealership, and the car dealer says, "You're going to love taking your kids to soccer practice in this thing." And you go, "Yeah, I would love that," right? He's already presuming that you are going to buy the car. He's not trying to sell you the car. He's already considered that you've bought it and you're going to love it when you take your kids to soccer practice. So same type of thing here, right? We have to act to prevent further incitement. That's presuming that there was already an incitement. Here's what he said. He said Trump argued he knew that his most hardcore supporters were willing to direct violence at elected officials after a kidnapping plot targeting Michigan Governor Whitmer last year was foiled. So he's talking about a whole entirely separate issue, totally outside the scope. And he's using it to show that there's a pattern here. He says, "My dear colleagues, is there any political leader in this world who believes that if he is ever allowed back by the Senate to get back into the Oval Office, that he would stop inciting violence to get his way? Would you bet the lives of more police officers on that? Would you bet the safety of your family on that? Would you bet the future of your democracy on that?" Very emotional, very charged language. He's basically talking about, sentencing at this point in time, and he's presuming that Donald Trump has already been convicted. In a criminal case, this type of language would have to be allowed, could be allowed at a sentencing phase, but not during the trial phase by most competent judges. After the January 6th attack, declared that his conduct is totally inappropriate, Raskin noted. He said, "So if he gets back into the office and it happens again, we'll have no one to blame but ourselves." So very emotional. And he was sort of setting the framework for the rest of this. Here's the slide on thinking past the sale. It's a persuasion tool where you get someone to think about what happens after they've made the decision or action. By doing so, you increase the odds that person actually makes the decision or takes that action. So like I said, the car dealer telling you, "You're going to love taking your kids to soccer practice in this," well, it may actually make that parent more likely to buy the car. And this goes on and tells you a little bit about how it works. It's about self-fulfilling prophecies, and this sort of, I thought it into reality. So they were doing a lot of that today. And then we have Rep. Lieu says Trump showed no remorse, did not acknowledge the role in inspiring the rioters. So it's kind of more of a sentencing argument here, where he's saying, if he would have been remorseful, maybe we wouldn't be here today. Donald Trump, if he would have just accepted responsibility, then we wouldn't have to be here. But since he's not showing any remorse, we know that he's going to do it again. So it's a very circular argument, and he's doing it here. He says Trump shows no genuine remorse, failed to take responsibility. Well, he hasn't been proven guilty of this thing yet for his role in inspiring the rioters. He urged senators to send a clear message with a vote to convict Trump to prevent another attack and deter future presidents who don't like the outcome of an election from believing they can follow Trump's lead. He said, "I'm not afraid of Donald Trump running again in 4 years. I'm afraid he's going to run again and lose because he can do this again," Lieu said. So, all right. I mean, it's not much there on point, other than to say that he deserves to be punished. But you got to prove that he did the thing that you're accusing him of first. So that was the highlight that came over from the Washington Post from his testimony. And, these were pretty short clips, blurbs that the Washington Post put up. So I'm just kind of going off of them. This is what they think is important. Washington Post, of course, in my opinion, is pretty favorable to a lot of sympathetic to the Democratic arguments. And we go on at 12:14 to Rep. DeGette, she says, or DeGette, I don't know how to say it, detailing how Trump emboldened domestic violent extremists. Okay, so this headline, this statement is a little bit closer. Now we're talking about some causation. Trump actually did something that emboldened the domestic violent extremists. So now we're not talking about sentencing or about inspiring future rioters or coming back and doing this again, or like Raskin was talking about, having this come back again if he's in the Oval Office a second time. Now we're talking about he did it, right? Or not. She says, this must be our wake-up call. We must condemn it because the threat is not over. All right, so we're not talking about what happened. We're talking about a continuing threat. Trump refused to condemn the type of violence. Instead, over and over, he's encouraged it. Our response must be different this time. So this is where she cites the Joint Intelligence Bulletin from the FBI, National Counterterrorism. They said that after the Capitol Hill attack, top law enforcement agencies reported there's an increase in credible threats to the inauguration, which is already done and over, from Donald Trump's supporters. So Joe Biden was inaugurated. It's done. That's over. They're still referencing this report. Okay. She says, quote here, the shared false narrative of a stolen election and opposition to change and control of the executive and legislative branches of governments may lead to some individuals to adopt the belief that there is a political solution to address their grievances and that violent action is necessary, these agencies warned. So she didn't say that. That's what the agencies said. So, here again, they're sort of, lifting this out from the weeds, not talking so much about what actually happened, but they're just saying, look, if we don't do something here, the consequences are likely to reoccur. We're going to be back here again because of something. Because it happened, we got to punish Trump, or else it's going to happen again, which is, it's very speculative, right? You don't know that. But you're making an argument because you're making an argument. You're appealing to emotion. You're appealing to fear. You're telling people this is an ongoing threat. Look, the FBI said so. The Counterterrorism Center said so. So we got to do something about this. Otherwise, we're all in jeopardy again. And that's good. That's a good use of fear. It's a good use of persuasion. Prosecutors try to do that all the time. They try to make your defendant look as scary as possible. And the defense side wants to reverse that. Make him look very benign, very, very lovable. They help grandmas cross the street and all that good stuff. So they're just trying to do that here. Instill a bunch of fear in the American people, arguably the senators, but the senators were asleep at the wheel. We have it at 12:30 right around lunchtime. Rep. Cicilline outlines the personal toll the attack took. So again, we've talked a lot about this. By about this point, I was getting really sick and tired of hearing a lot of the personal toil and tumult that took place here. We got it. We saw like 4 hours of videos and imagery yesterday. So today, he goes back again. Look how awful this was. Yep, we got it. He says he detailed the physical and emotional toll. Got it, right? Yeah, including police officers who were injured or killed. We're going to talk about Brian Sicknick today. The attack on January 6th is one of the bloodiest intrusions in the Capitol since the British invaded in the War of 1812 and burned it to the ground. Really dramatic language. They were in there for about 2 hours, and they were on their way. He opened a presentation by the harm done by the riot. They came perilously close to reaching the first 3 people in the line of the presidency. And we saw that yesterday. I'm not trying to downplay it. It was an awful situation, terrible, but this is already in evidence. We already got it. In fact, Donald Trump's attorney made the same point. He said, hey, we'll stipulate to this stuff. Okay, you don't need to play video after video after. We'll agree with it. We agree that it was bad and everything that happened was bad. What we disagree about is whether Trump caused it or not. So if they would be addressing the cause, that would be better. But here, again, they're talking about the damage, the aftermath, without really getting to the meat of the argument, which is unfortunate. He says here, it wasn't just the vice president and the speaker. Rioters were prepared to take any member of Congress they found. He goes on, many were just kids, 20-somethings who came here to work because they believed in their country and they believed in working to make it better. Since January 6th, at least 7 members who hid with other members have tested positive for COVID. So now it goes to COVID, right? Harm. Look how harmful this is. At least 38 Capitol police officers have either tested positive or been exposed. Nearly 200 National Guard troops who were deployed to our nation's capital provide all of us with the protection. They've all tested positive. Well, it could have been because your party, who was in control of the Senate and the House floor, had a bunch of the National Guard sleeping on the ground throughout the congressional building, thrown in a garage with no facilities. That might have been the cause of it. You called them there in the aftermath and had them just kind of posted around until a couple days later they got some cots finally delivered to them, or they could have gotten it from any other source. But you can see what they're doing. They're expanding the scope. That net is getting so wide that they're just trying to capture any possible ramification from this thing, including COVID, that there's really no causal connection that they can make legitimately to tie it to the specific day on January 6th. I mean, if they can make that claim, then I guess that's fine. But I'm not sure that they can, okay, because it's a virus and it's been quite some time since this all took place. And there are other superseding and intervening causes that could cause somebody to have COVID. Wasn't just what happened on January 6th. All right, but they got to do what they got to do. They got to lump COVID into it as well. So about 1:30, we get Rep. Castro says the Senate impeachment is a chance to send a message back to the world about what America stands for. Felicia Sanmez posted this update. So again, they're talking about, this is the high ground maneuver. They're lifting it up. They're just explaining that the world is watching. He says here, since the incident at the Capitol, Russian, Iranian, Chinese influence actors have seized the opportunity to amplify the narratives in furtherance of their policy interest amid the presidential transition. He pressed senators to take action. We cannot let them use what happened on January 6th to define us, who we are and what we stand for. We get to define ourselves by how we respond to the attack on January 6th. He noted, even our allies are speaking up, and quoted Canadian and German officials denouncing the attack and calling for accountability. So, okay, so, right, it's the high ground. It's, hey, this hurt America. Our allies are looking at us. This is sort of, I think they call this concern trolling. I actually get a lot of this sometimes from some of my peers. They'll reach out and say, Rob, the things you talk about on your show, they're just concerning to me, and I hope that you can do better. I'm just thinking about you, right? Same argument here. Our allies are just looking at America. Hey, America, we're worried about this. We're worried about you. Now's your opportunity to change course. Will you do that? And that's persuasive to people, right? That's why it's called concern trolling. It works because people go, oh man, maybe I am being a piece of garbage. Maybe I should think of this moment in history. Maybe I am Senator Mitt Romney and I go, yeah, you know what? Yeah, maybe I care about what the Russians think. Okay, you're right. I'm going to vote to impeach him. So it's the high ground maneuver. It's fallacious as hell. It's not pertinent to the underlying issue about whether Trump caused this or not, but it is persuasive. And a lot of people around the country are going to fall for that hook, line, and sinker. They're just going to listen to that and go, yeah, we got to do something here. And it riles a lot of people up, right? The rest of the world is watching and judging us. All right. So then we get this afternoon over to Rep. Neguse, who argues against Trump's First Amendment defense. And what does he say here? This update was by Colby Itkowitz over at the Washington Post. He says here, he began the House manager's task of preemptively dismantling Trump's defense, beginning with the notion that a former president's January 6th speech was protected by the First Amendment. And we saw some of these arguments in both memorandum that were submitted to the Senate prior to the trial starting. And these are the pre-buttals. So we have Neguse, and then we have Ted Lieu, who comes back for our last update. And when Joe was on the floor, he said, they are concerned not with the facts that actually occurred, the facts that we've proven, which is debatable, but with an alternative set of facts where President Trump did nothing but deliver a controversial speech at a rally. The congressman noted that several legal experts have called the First Amendment defense, quote, legally frivolous, and said it's a distraction to avoid discussing the facts of the case. President Trump wasn't just some guy with political opinions who showed up at a rally and delivered controversial remarks. He's the president of the U.S. He had spent months and months using the unique power of that office, his bully pulpit, to spread the big lie that the election had been stolen. And as somebody who's a big fan of the First Amendment, I think it's critical. I think it's absolutely essential to what happens in this country. That's why it's the First Amendment. I've made that point many times. There is nothing, I think, that is secondary to that, because you have to talk. You have to be able to talk freely in order to talk about any other issue in the country, right? If you can't communicate, then you can't talk about anything. And there are no issues that can be resolved. And I think that this is it's a bad precedent. I think it's a bad argument. I think it's very disappointing to hear that we have elected people in this country who have sworn an oath to uphold and defend our Constitution, who are then going in to a legal proceeding and making arguments that the First Amendment is just kind of a suggestion in most situations. We believe in it unless you're the president. We believe that you can talk about problems with our government, petition for a redress of grievances, freedom of expression. That's okay unless you're the president. Doesn't the president have the biggest stake of anybody in making sure that things are running well? If the president thought that the election was stolen, Do we want him to not say that, or do we want him to be able to say that? I would imagine you would want them to be able to say that. Okay, and politicians, they have, if they think that an election was stolen or fraudulent or had irregularities or whatever, then you would want them to speak up about it. And if we set a precedent here where now it's because you're the president, and if you disavow or you disagree with how an election was run and you voice that, now what are you? You're inciting insurrection, so you can't talk about that stuff anymore. It's not a good argument. It's, I think, counter to the one of the most fundamental principles that is enshrined in our Constitution in this country. It's very disappointing to see him make that claim, but I understand why they're doing it, because it's a strong defense. It's a very strong defense. We want people to be able to speak their minds, and political speech is so highly protected, and I think Trump's speech falls directly within that. And we have the Brandenburg test to show us that. We've got a lot of other case law to show us that. So, I understand that they've got to go out there and make the best argument they can. I think this is a disappointing argument, especially from one of our elected officials. And then lastly, our last pre-buttal comes over from Ted Lieu. He said that they're rejecting the claim of an unfair trial. So, these were the posts this is what he said. Not a lot of quotes here because they were summarizing his argument. He says House Democrats sought to preemptively undercut arguments from Trump's lawyers about the impeachment process in anticipation of the presentation. He defended the House decision to impeach Trump before he left office. He says that Trump's lawyers suggested that he was not given due process because the House deliberately delayed the start of the Senate trial. Lieu reminded senators about that an impeachment proceeding is distinct from a criminal trial. Yes, we know that, because in those trials, a defendant has certain constitutional rights because the potential punishment includes a prison sentence. He's saying, even so, Trump's attorneys will have an opportunity starting Friday to make their case to the Senate and ask questions. President Trump is receiving any and all process that is due. Okay, so he doesn't actually address the allegation, right, that Trump's not getting a fair shake here. And I've already sort of beaten that to death. He has not been able to cross-examine any witnesses. All of the evidence that's been admitted has been hearsay, stacked on hearsay. It's statements from tweets. It's reports from CNN people. It's all external sources. You have a judge who is a Democrat, who's a witness and a juror. You have a snap impeachment. You've got, the whole thing was just, okay. The scope was expanded beyond anything that would have been allowed in a regular court of law. And so what he says is, due process? Well, we gave him the due process that's due because this isn't like a criminal trial. This is like a impeachment trial. And he got the due process that he needs, all right? He's not going to prison for this thing. So don't try to equate this to a criminal trial, even though it's high crimes or misdemeanors, and one of those high crimes, allegedly according to their own documents, is incitement for insurrection. So shouldn't it have some of the remnants of criminal procedure in impeachment procedure? Shouldn't it be closely analogous? And it's not. Ted Lieu just says, okay, he's not going to prison, therefore it's a different standard. And under the different standard, which he didn't define for us, he says he's gotten any and all process that is due. All right. So that's basically a recap of what happened today. As I mentioned, the good and the bad. Democrats, good persuasion, a lot of thinking past the sale, a lot of talk about an ongoing threat, very emotional, very charged language. They took the high grounds where they were saying this is about the world now. This isn't about Trump versus the Democrats. This is about the world. What do our allies think? They talked a little bit about due process in the First Amendment, and they had generally good energy. They were overly duplicative when we get to the bad about their personal stories. We saw a lot of that, a lot of harm, a lot of trauma, a lot of, everything is awful now because of Trump, and we got to punish him as a result. They expanded the scope way beyond anything that I thought was reasonable. They're now talking about the world. Now they're using that to their advantage, but I think in terms of legitimate procedure, it was just way too much. They were talking about post-incitement. What did he do after the fact? Well, that's not relevant to what he did to cause it. They were talking about the damage that took place. They really spent a lot of time talking about the need for penalties in order to make sure that this doesn't happen again, thinking past the sale. They watered down the First Amendment beyond any recognition, in my opinion. Very little addressing of the due process in a substantive way that would have made a lawyer satisfied. And they were really focused on the consequences, not so much on the actual criminality. You got to prove criminality before you can talk about what the consequences are, and they sort of flipped that a little bit. Now, Trump is going to be starting tomorrow. His defense team apparently is going to be wrapping this thing up in one day. So they got 16 hours. Sounds like they're probably going to use 4 or 5 of it, which is not a bad strategy. This article came over from CNN. And it was written by Caitlin Collins. She says here, former President Donald Trump defense team, they expect to finish its argument in the trial by Friday night. 2 sources tell CNN. So that's going to be tomorrow night. His lawyers will take the Senate floor on Friday after the impeachment managers wrap up on Thursday today, but they're not expected to use all of their allotted time. Each side gets 16 hours for a presentation. Attorneys David Scone, Bruce Castor, Michael Vanderveen, we got William Brennan. They're all expected to speak tomorrow during Friday's arguments, according to a person familiar with the plan. They're going to be using videos of Democratic lawmakers. They plan to argue the Democrats glorified violence by recreating the January 6 riots, which is a bizarre argument to make. I'll get into that. They will claim that the trial is unconstitutional, and they're going to stress Trump's First Amendment rights. Those are good arguments, I think. Trial's unconstitutional, very, very limited, due process. And we also saw a First Amendment argument, which I think is going to be another argument. Good argument. Because the defense team is so disorganized, Trump's allies are apprehensive about how the defense will go. Trump erupted on Tuesday as Castro made a meandering, bizarre opening statement, the same statement that we sort of were scratching our heads about. So let's go back to this. They plan to argue that the Democrats glorified violence by recreating the January 6 riots. I don't understand what that argument is. So they're going to go out there tomorrow and say the Democrats played that evidence and that's glorifying violence. Okay, so what? So what do you want them to do about that? Dismiss the impeachment or vote? I don't understand. So this is why these types of arguments are bad. If you are saying that I did something bad, but you also did something bad, you are sort of giving up your argument, right? You're acknowledging that you did something bad. So why would the Trump attorneys go out there and say, oh, well, you Democrats did something bad? That's sort of presuming that you're admitting that Trump did something bad. And you're saying, well, what you did is just as bad. It's sort of, irrelevant. It's not what you're trying to prove. If you wanted to prove that, or at least make the argument that the Democrats have also said things like fight, 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 yeah, that's a separate thing. But glorifying violence by recreating the January 6th riot, don't know where they're going with that, but we'll see what they have tomorrow. Lindsey Graham was out and he said the not guilty vote is growing after today. He posted this early this morning. So before he even presumably, when was that? Yeah, he posted that early today. So probably on the East Coast. The not guilty vote is growing after today. He said, I think most Republicans found the presentation by the House managers offensive and absurd. Full interview here. So that's one man's take on it. He was on Hannity if you want to go watch that entire clip. The link is in the slides. So that's it for day one of impeachment. We've got tomorrow scheduled for Donald Trump, and it sounds like his defense team is going to be buttoning it up tomorrow. Maybe we'll get a vote. Maybe we'll get a vote Saturday or Sunday. Maybe we'll get a vote tomorrow. We can just close this and just put it back in the closet in the bottom. We'll never have to see it again. That sounds pretty good. All right, so let's change gears, kind of closely related. The next story, Officer Brian Sicknick, Capitol Hill police officer, we all know he died shortly after the Capitol Hill riots. And when we originally heard about his death, it was on the premise that he was murdered by the Capitol Hill rioters. Well, now there's kind of new evidence that is coming out. I want to go back through this carefully because I want to make sure that we respect him, we respect his death, and I want to make sure that we pay tribute to him. We certainly want to honor his memory and thank him for his service. Certainly don't want anybody dying in this country early unnecessarily. That being said, we got to be real clear on what happened here. How did he die? Because there was this big rush to say that he was killed by these rioters. And now the evidence just doesn't match up to that, it's looking like. So let's go back to the Democratic memorandum that they submitted in the Donald Trump impeachment proceedings, and they reference this. They say the insurrectionists killed a Capitol Police officer by striking him in the head with a fire extinguisher. So this top sentence here, I clipped this right out from their memorandum. They killed a Capitol Police officer by striking him in the head with a fire extinguisher. And they have footnote 131. If you go down to 131 down here, is written by a guy over at the New York Times, January 8th, so 2 days after the Capitol Hill insurrection, 2021, Mark Santora said Capitol Hill police officer dies from injuries in pro-Trump rampage. And so this is part of the problem when you are going through a formal legal proceeding and you're only referencing the news articles that were written just 2 days after the Capitol Hill riots. And so they're claiming as fact that the insurrectionists killed a police officer by striking him in the head with a fire extinguisher. Okay, so you can prove or disprove that. And the media was just running hog wild with this. And we saw this, and it was a gross day in general. And so you may have missed this in sort of the barrage of information flying around. So on the New York Times, so there's a great article that's posted over at revolver.news. They actually took these screenshots. I did not take these screenshots. Revolver.news they did the heavy lifting on this article. So go check them out. And I think Tucker Carlson covered this last night as well. He said from the New York Times, he dreamed of being a police officer. Then he was killed by a pro-Trump mob. We have another one. Then on Wednesday, pro-Trump rioters attacked the citadel of democracy. They overpowered Mr. Sicknick, who's 42, struck him in the head with a fire extinguisher, according to 2 law enforcement officials, with a bloody gash in his head. He was rushed to the hospital and placed on life support. He died on Thursday evening. Okay, so that was the original synopsis from the media. Then we had, even before that, we had on January 7th, the U.S. Capitol Police, they also posted a press release, and they said here at approximately 9:30 p.m., on January 7th, U.S. Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick passed away due to injuries sustained while on duty. He was responding to the riots on Wednesday. He was injured while physically engaging with protesters. He returned to his division and collapsed. He was taken to a local hospital. He succumbed to his injuries. It's going to be investigated by the Metro Police and the department's homicide branch, the U.S. Capitol Police, and our federal partners. So a lot of people. Metro PD, the homicide branch, we got the U.S. Capitol Police, we got our federal partners. He joined the unit in 2008, and they expressed their deep sympathies, which of course we do as well. Speaking of that investigation, there was a lot of people, a lot of manpower going into this, and women power. Let's say a lot of people power, just to be inclusive on the show. Federal murder probe opened for Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick, who died following the riots. He was the 5th person to die as a result of the siege. The U.S. Attorney's Office, so that's with the Department of Justice, they opened a federal murder investigation into the death of Brian Sicknick, who died Thursday night after suffering injuries into the violent siege in the Capitol. 3 law enforcement sources confirmed to ABC News. This article was posted on January 8th, so 2 days afterwards, or 1 day after he died. The investigation is conducted jointly between the FBI, so we got the feds involved, and the D.C. Metro Police with cooperation from the U.S. Capitol Police. So major law enforcement sources are all floating around. Acting Attorney General Jeff Rosen at the time said in a statement that the Department of Justice, quote, will spare no resources in investigating and holding accountable those responsible. Okay, and I agree with that, right? And for a long time since the Capitol Hill riots took place, I've been very, very interested in seeing what the official reports look like. What really happened here? Well, Revolver News, as I had mentioned, they posted this article, which made it onto Tucker last night, and they said, MAGA blood libel. Why are they hiding the medical report? And what you can do is you can go read that whole article. There's a lot of links, a lot of stuff here, but what I've done is I've sort of clipped a couple things that they were referencing here, and I just want to run through them. So first and foremost, they're saying here, they're pointing us over to ProPublica, and they say that, maybe he wasn't hit over the head. Maybe he wasn't gashed in the head with a fire extinguisher. They say before the officer's death had been officially announced late Thursday, the Sicknick family was rushing from its home in New Jersey to see him in a Washington area hospital as word circulated on social media that Capitol Police officers succumbed to grave injuries. So there was confusion about whether he was actually dead or not. Okay, the family was rushing over there. They had already seen posts that he was dead. Then the Capitol Hill Police came back out and said, no, he's actually not dead. And then he actually died. So last they heard, he was in critical condition on a ventilator, according to family members who spoke to ProPublica. While the news report said an unnamed officer was in critical condition after being bludgeoned with a fire extinguisher, family members did not have details of his injuries. They say Sicknick had texted them Wednesday night saying that while he had been pepper sprayed, he was in good spirits. The text arrived hours after the mob's assault on the Capitol had left more than 50 officers injured and 5 people dead. So his brother, Ken Sicknick, says, he texted me last night and said, I got pepper sprayed twice and he was in good shape. Family drove towards Washington. Apparently, though, he collapsed in the Capitol and they resuscitated him using CPR, which we're going to see whether that's accurate or not, right? But the day after that text exchange, the family got word that Brian Sicknick had a blood clot and had a stroke. The ventilator was keeping him alive. We weren't expecting it, his brother said. So just awful, as a family, going through that, losing a brother, it's just terrible. So this is another article that came over from CNN. It says, this is interesting. So on February 2nd, remember this article over at ProPublica was written 2 days after the fact. Okay, so January 8th, they're sort of piecing together what happened with Sicknick's brother. Then, basically, less than a month goes by. February 2nd, we have a new report. Investigators struggle to build a murder case in the death of U.S. Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick. And that's been something I've been saying for a long time. The people who really did the damage on January 6th, they have to be prosecuted. They have to. And that's coming from me as a defense attorney. You're saying, wait a minute, they got to go prosecute these people? Of course, yeah, because if they don't, then it's going to undermine our entire judicial system. People are going to say, well, the MAGA people just got off with a slap on the wrist. Nobody's getting prosecuted for this. And they're going to use that to pass new draconian laws that are going to wreck the rest of the justice system, if it's not already wrecked. Okay, it's going to be used as a hammer to really make it more difficult on defendants everywhere. So I don't want that. I want to make sure that the people who really did the damage, that they're prosecuted according to law. I want to make sure that the people who were not there and who really did not cause damage are given a slap on the wrist, probation. We talked about several stories here where people were there the next day and they're being charged with federal crimes. They showed up the next day. They're being charged for text messages and things like that. But what about the people who murdered Brian Sicknick? Where are they? Why have they not been able to find them? Let's dig in. Investigators are struggling to build a federal murder case regarding a fallen U.S. Capitol Police officer, Brian Sicknick, vexed by a lack of evidence that could prove someone caused his death as he defended the Capitol during last month's insurrection. Authorities have reviewed video and photographs that show Sicknick engaging with rioters amid the siege, but have yet to identify a moment in which he suffered his fatal injuries, law enforcement officials familiar with the matter said. Soon after Sicknick died on January 7th, prosecutors in Washington opened a federal murder investigation, dedicating a team inside the U.S. Attorney's Office to build out a case, authorities said. And we've already heard from other people from the FBI and other law enforcement agencies there in D.C. that they are looking at hundreds of thousands of images, videos, documents. I mean, they've got just teams of people. And we've covered a lot of these indictments and these arrest warrants. People around the country are getting just rounded up. They're going to Arizona. I think there was a handful of, Proud Boys who were just picked up here. They were going to Hawaii. We've seen people in Colorado, Florida, all over the country. Law enforcement is going and capturing those people. So in the impeachment proceedings, when they're saying Donald Trump has to be held accountable for all of this stuff, you're saying, well, he didn't cause all of it. Okay. He said some things you didn't like, but the people who were responsible for the actual damage, which in my opinion is where the standard should be. It's not about what you say, but it's about what people do. That's a better line. That's a better thing to enforce. That's a better way to administer justice based on actions, less than what people are saying. It's a bright line versus where the speech is not a bright line, and speech will slowly be just whittled away. Your freedom to speak will be whittled away. Here we have the allegation that somebody killed another man. And there's hundreds of videos all over the internet, thousands probably of videos, images, and photographs. They've dedicated the FBI, U.S. Capitol Police, U.S. Attorney's Office from the Department of Justice, or have a whole team dedicated to this stuff. So where are they? Where is this person? Well, they can't find him. To date, little information has been shared publicly about the circumstances of the death of the 13-year veteran of the police force, including any findings from an autopsy that was conducted by D.C.'s medical examiner. Why not? In a statement the day after the insurrection, Capitol Police said Sicknick had been, quote, injured while physically engaging with protesters. He collapsed as a result of his injuries. He died later the next day. We read you that statement. It goes on, in Sicknick's case, it's still not known publicly what caused him to collapse the night of the insurrection. Findings from a medical examiner's review have not been released. Authorities have not made any announcements about that ongoing process. According to one law enforcement official, medical examiners did not find signs that the officer sustained any blunt force trauma. So investigators believe that the early report that he was fatally struck by a fire extinguisher are not true. One possibility being considered by investigators is that he became ill after interacting with a chemical irritant like pepper spray or bear spray that was deployed in the crowd. And that is corroborated by what his brother said, right, in those text messages. Investigators reviewing the video of the officer's time around the Capitol haven't been able to confirm that in tape that has been recovered so far. The case could be complicated if Sicknick had pre-existing medical conditions. It could not be learned if he did. Why not? Spokesman for the U.S. Capitol Police declined to comment. Then today, so that was a February 2nd article. Then today, new information comes out. New video helping investigators in search for the suspects in the U.S. Capitol Police officer's death. Federal authorities have narrowed down to a handful the number of suspects in the death of Brian Sicknick. U.S. official briefed on the probe said Wednesday, raising hopes that investigators can bring charges in the case. New video evidence shows it has aided the work of the FBI and prosecutors in what official investigators continue to view as a complicated and difficult case. Our leading theory that investigators are considering is that one of the suspects sprayed an irritant, perhaps bear spray, that caused him to suffer a fatal reaction, according to CNN. He was a 13-year veteran. He collapsed in his office after being, quote, injured while physically engaging with protesters. They struggled for weeks to build a case. Several people have been charged with assaulting police officers, but none in relation to Sicknick. They've dedicated a team. It's being investigated by everybody we've already talked about. Public information officer from the Metro PD, Sean Hickman, told CNN the case remains under active investigation. There is no further information available to provide at this time. All right. Well, the autopsy has to be done. Okay. This is something that we pulled over from PBS. Revolver also linked over here. If you're looking at autopsies, forensic pathologist Dr. Steven Sina says that autopsies are best performed if done within 24 hours of death. Before organs deteriorate, ideally before embalming, which can interfere with toxicology and blood cultures. But autopsies performed on decomposed or even exhumed bodies can still provide vital new information. They usually take 2 to 4 hours to perform. Preliminary results can be released within 24 hours, but the full results may take up to 6 weeks to prepare. So we're getting close to that timeline, right? It's been about just over a month since he was killed or died. And presumably the autopsy is done because he was cremated. Okay? He was put on display, honored at the U.S. Capitol ceremony by the Democratic leaders. And those are his remains. So he's been cremated. He arrives to lie in honor at the Capitol Rotunda. Are we going to learn more about that? I'd be very curious to see if there are murder charges. If there's evidence that he was murdered, that person should be murdered. But, not murdered, that person should be prosecuted, right? And then it's up to a judge and a jury to decide what the sentence is for him. But got to be very careful when we start throwing around those allegations when there's not evidence there to support it yet. The media went hog wild with it. The media this was all over the place. Everybody was saying that the Capitol Hill rioters murdered a police officer. We don't know if that's true yet. And this was something that fueled a lot of what took place in the impeachment proceedings. They were leaning on this in their memorandum. This was part of their theme. This was part of their parade of horrible things that happened on that day. And it's facts, not in evidence yet. Could be. Might come out later. They might have found that new evidence and it shows clearly that somebody hit him with something that would have killed him. But we don't know. It's not in evidence yet. All right. Last story of the day. We've been following Derek Chauvin and the George Floyd case since it happened. We covered it basically live. I mean, we covered it, I think, that same day. And it was something that has been percolating in the courts for some period of time. We're coming up on a trial deadline that's taking place in March. And so there's been a lot of activity in Derek's case. Derek Chauvin is the guy, the exact officer, you may remember this picture, who had his knee on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes, resulting in George Floyd dying. Okay, and they're debating whether or not this is murder or not. I think you know my opinion on this. I think it was totally outside of his authority. I think he's not protected by qualified immunity. I think it was murder, and I think he is going to be probably convicted of this. But I wanted to run through his case because I want to show you all of the activity that's been taking place here. A lot of it. This is from the docket that you can find. It's part of public records over on the Minnesota court's website. And this is Derek Chauvin's case. A lot of stuff happening here. And remember, he's also sort of being prosecuted along with the 3 other officers who were there. I think it's Jay Kung, we got Tad Thao, and there's some other guy. I can't remember his name right now. But they're all sort of being prosecuted together. A lot of activity in Derek's case. So let's run through just a couple of what we're seeing here. We've got motions in limine. I'm going to explain what those are here shortly. February 8th, we also got a witness list. We got proposed jury instructions. So what are the jurors going to be listening to? It's just proposal, so you can debate those things out. A memorandum opposing the state's motion to reinstate third-degree murder charges came up. We got another memo, and the state submitted a bunch of documents here. So we've got the proposed jury instructions from the state. We got the state's prospective witness list, which is massive. I think there's probably, I didn't count them, but maybe 100 witnesses that are on that list. We have the state's motion in limine. We're going to dive into those specifically today. We're going to spend a lot of time, not a lot of time, but we're going to run through this section here. And we'll talk about what a motion in limine is. Then yesterday, we saw that there was these additional motions for admission of new lawyers. So Victoria Joseph must be an out-of-state lawyer because she's applying to join his defense team as pro hoc vice. So she's out of state, but she's asking for permission to hop on this case. Same type of thing here for, looks like Gray Kilgore. We've got another one here, Victoria Joseph, Harrison Gray Kilgore. So they're trying to get on the case. And then today we've got an order and a memo denying the state's motion to add back that third-degree murder charge. So most of this stuff is kind of procedural and routine. The big thing I wanted to talk about was this motion in limine, because these are interesting. And motions in limine are very frequently used in criminal law. And basically what they say is, well, I have a definition here. Let me show you what Wikipedia says. Don't take my word for it. In law, a motion in limine is a motion discussed outside the presence of the jury to request that certain evidence or testimony be excluded. A motion in limine can be used to get a ruling to allow for the inclusion of evidence as well. The motion is decided by a judge in both civil and criminal proceedings. We're talking about criminal law here. It's frequently used at pre-trial hearings or during a trial. It can be used at the both federal and state levels. So what motions in limine do is you're sort of fleshing out the rules of the proceeding of the trial before it starts. So one of the easiest examples that I can give you is in a DUI trial. If you are going to be presenting your case, one of the things that officers like to do a lot is if they're going to be sort of performing the field sobriety test. So let's say your client's under investigation for a DUI. All right. The officer is going to say, well, I gave him the field sobriety test, and based on that, I thought that there was enough probable cause to give him a breathalyzer, arrest him, take him down to the station, and continue my investigation, draw a blood sample, and impound that into evidence, and blah, blah, blah. So they'll say, so sometimes defense attorneys will question them about the field sobriety tests, or we call them roadside agility maneuvers, to see how agile you are on the side of the road. They call them field sobriety tests. They call them standardized field sobriety tests because that sounds very official. Really, you're trying to, they want you to do cartwheels and stuff outside on the side of the road. It's kind of a joke. But the point here, I digress, is that when they are explaining their field sobriety test to the jury, one of the things that the police like to do is get up and show you how good they are at performing them. And the field sobriety tests are actually pretty hard to perform. I've actually done this in group presentations in different networking groups. When I have to present something, I'll stand up and I'll sort of read through the instructions. I'll pick a person who's a part of that group, and I'll say, hey, I'm going to give you some field sobriety tests. It's 9 a.m. You haven't had anything to drink, right? No, nothing. Okay, great. So you just read through the instructions that the police use in their legitimate investigations, and you ask them to perform it. Stand on one leg, walk and turn, any of those agility tests. People just fail them because they're not easy to do typically. And so what an officer will do in order to sort of rebut that and to show the jury just how easy these tests are is they'll get up and they'll perform them in the middle of the trial. So you have a police officer who stands up and says, yep, so here's what I did. I told them to stand here, and they just put their hands to the side and they just, move their feet like this. And the officers are typically, if they're inclined to do this, they're typically very good at it, right? It looks excellent. Like it looks like, oh, that's it. That test is super easy. You can just stand, put your heel to toe, take 9 steps. Don't lift up that last foot on that 9th step and just pivot around and heel to toe, walk your way back. And when the cops do it, it looks beautiful. You're like, wow, it's pretty easy. They got nice boots on. They're ready to go. They've practiced it 100 times. Now, a client or a random person you find at a restaurant or at a mall or a grocery store, they're going to fail it like 9 times out of 10 because it's hard and you don't know how to follow the instructions. And so what a defense attorney, this is a very long story, what a defense attorney will do with a motion in limine is they'll tell the court that they don't want the officer to be able to stand up and perform the test in front of the jury, and they'll give them a laundry list of reasons why. Right? It's not probative. It's too prejudicial. The officer has obviously had a lot of training and experience here. Our client didn't. It's not relevant to the fact. The jury is going to be sort of biased by thinking, oh, well, it was so easy for him to do it, it must be easy for our client to do it. It's sort of a false equivalency argument there. And so you file this motion in limine to say, you can't do that, officer, and you ask the judge to hold that ruling. And typically the judge will say, yeah, you're right. It's not really relevant. He doesn't need to stand up and show it. And so you're arguing about that rule. Now, if you don't file it as a motion in limine, if you're not addressing it before you go into the courtroom, then the downside might be that you just don't know, right? If you're in the middle of your line of questioning, the officer might stand up and start performing it, and you go, whoa, objection, no, I don't want to do this. And now you're having this conversation in front of the jury, and the jury's going, that's weird. Why doesn't that defense attorney want him to stand up and perform those tests? That doesn't make any sense. And so the jury's mind gets all spun out, and they can lose sight of what the underlying issue is, what the point you're trying to make is. And so you want to just hash this stuff out before the trial even starts. Extremely long explanation of a motion in limine, but that's what they're doing here for Derek Chauvin. They're trying to say that the state government, the prosecutor, and this can be a little bit hard to follow because it's the government prosecuting a police officer. Typically, the government is representing the police officers, or they're on behalf of the police officers. They wouldn't like my categorization of that. They would say, no, we don't represent them. They're witnesses. Whatever, right? They're on the same team. Let's just put it that way. So they are usually on the same side. In this case, they're not. The government is prosecuting a former police officer. And what they're saying is, when Derek comes into court, we don't want him to be able to do these things. And they're trying to hash these rules out before the jury gets impaneled. All right, so here's what they're saying is not appropriate. They say, number one, the first motion, defendant Chauvin may not impeach a witness with a statement from a third-party summary if the witness does not adopt that document as his or her prior statement. So the government, the prosecutor here, wants to prohibit Derek Chauvin from impeaching. So that would be sort of calling into question any witness with a statement from a third-party summary, such as a report that was prepared by the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension or the FBI, if the witness does not adopt that document as his or her prior statement. So in other words, they want to make sure that the witnesses are saying what the witnesses are saying. They're not taking some third-party statement from the FBI or something, some summary that was generated for them. Pretty standard, not that interesting, right? Judge will probably grant that one. The court should exclude any testimony by an expert witness concerning the opinion of any non-testifying expert he or she consulted. Okay, so you see how sort of in the weeds this stuff is, right? It's kind of hard to make sense of this. The state moves the court to prevent any expert witness. So if somebody comes in, let's say you have the person who performed the autopsy, the medical examiner, they come in. They want to prevent an expert witness from testifying regarding the opinion of any other expert he or she consulted who is not testifying at trial. So if the autopsy person calls another autopsy person and that other autopsy person is not testifying at trial, then they want the first autopsy person to not be able to reference the second autopsy person. Okay. In particular, the state moves to exclude any statement by a testifying expert witness that a non-testifying expert witness reviewed, supported, contributed to the testifying expert witness analysis or conclusions. Yeah, so this is like, these are so convoluted. Contributed or testifying expert's opinion, analysis, or conclusions, or that a non-testifying expert agreed with the testifying expert's opinion, analysis, or conclusions. So what they're trying to say here is you have one expert witness who's going to come in and they're going to refer to other testimony from other people who are not experts, and they don't want those other statements to be able to come in. In other words, you cannot have one expert witness who references and utilizes a bunch of non-expert testimony in their testimony. All right. So this is what lawyers do. Isn't this fun? We have Chauvin should be foreclosed from arguing incorrect legal standards to the jury or from presenting evidence specifically addressed to these incorrect standards. So this is a little bit more interesting, and you can see where the government's argument is coming into play here. The state moves to prohibit defendant Chauvin from arguing at trial that one, that the state must show that he intended to kill George Floyd. Okay. They don't want him to be able to say that. They want him specifically to not use that language, right? I didn't intend to do it. Okay, well, that's not the standard is what they're saying. Intention doesn't matter. Or that he intended to cause bodily harm. They're saying that's the wrong standard. Or number two, the state must show but for causation to establish that the causation element of the charged offense. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. The state also requests the court prohibit Chauvin from presenting evidence or testimony that specifically addresses whether these incorrect legal standards have been satisfied. So we talked a little bit about but for causation in the context of the Trump impeachment proceedings, right? But for means something would not have happened but for that person's activity, right? This mug that I have on my glass would not have fallen over but for me knocking it off the table. If I didn't knock it off the table, it's going to be sitting there permanently. And so what was the cause of it falling off the table? It was me. It was my hand. It was my backhand. That's the cause. And what they're saying here is that they don't want Derek Chauvin to come in and say, I wasn't the cause of his death. My knee was not the cause. So what Chauvin's going to do is say, no, I didn't do it. It was something else. It was drugs. Probably is going to be the defense. And they're saying that's not the standard, okay? You don't have to be the only cause. You don't have to be the but-for cause. Let's go on to the next slide. The state, the government is saying that's because the state does not need to prove that. They don't have to prove the but-for causation. For the second-degree murder, the second-degree manslaughter charges, the state need not prove that the actions were the but-for cause of Floyd's death. Instead, the state must prove only that his actions were, quote, a substantial causal factor in Floyd's death. Minnesota Court of Appeals said the substantial causal factor test is more accurately worded, but in terms of but for cause, but rather the question is, was the defendant's conduct a substantial factor in bringing about the forbidden result? So was Derek Chauvin's knee on George Floyd's neck, was it a substantial causal factor in his death? Probably, right? And you're going to have to lean on some expert testimony in order to hash that out. A defendant's actions are a substantial causal factor so long as they, quote, contributed to the death. That's quoting a Minnesota Court of Appeals case from 1987. The state need not prove, quote, the specific mechanism of death or that the defendant's acts were the sole cause of death. Once again, quoting some of the same case law. Instead, the defendant's act only need to be a proximate cause of injury, meaning the defendant's acts caused injury directly or through a natural sequence of events. So they're just trying to get, this is why we spent so much time and I had so many issues with the Democrats' impeachment proceeding. They didn't spend much time talking about causation, just little touches here and there. This is critical. This is a huge part of the case. They're going to be fighting over this. This is why this is in their motion, because it's about causation. And this is probably going to be the entire crux of the defense. I didn't do it. He was on drugs. He was going to die anyways. I don't think it's going to be successful, but it's an argument, and it's actually a good argument. And our last one from them, it says the court should exclude or limit any argument, evidence, or testimony regarding the MPD's, so that would be the Minneapolis police decision-making process. Minneapolis, in terminating Chauvin's employment or MPD's civil liability. So obviously Chauvin got fired. He's in custody. The state moves to exclude any argument, evidence, or testimony regarding their decision-making process in terminating Chauvin. They also want the court to exclude any argument, evidence, or testimony suggesting that the Metro PD may face civil liability stemming from George Floyd's death. Why would they do that? Why would the government not want the defense to be able to talk about that? If they were to bring this up, if they were to say, hey, if you convict him, they're going to sue the hell out of the police department. Why would you not want that to happen? Well, maybe the police department is something that is looked upon favorably by the jurors. The jurors don't want the police department to be sued into oblivion. So maybe they say, well, we're not going to find him guilty then because of the consequences that may impact the Minneapolis Police Department, which is probably the same department that governs where they live. And if they have a bankrupt police department, maybe they're less secure. So you don't want them to be able to talk about those things, because it's distracting from the issue. The extent the court determines the evidence on these topics may be admissible for limited purpose for attempting to show bias, the state respectfully requests the court limit the evidence on such extraneous matters because it could lead to decision-making on an improper basis, confusion of the issues, and cross-examination that is only marginally relevant. Right? Extraneous matters. confusion of the issues. Kind of hard to cross-examine about those issues, right? This is the type of stuff that you fight over in a criminal proceeding. You didn't see any of this in the impeachment proceedings, right? Because it didn't follow any of these rules. This is the type of stuff you argue about regularly. Another interesting article came up today, which is what prompted me wanting to cover this story. Apparently, Bill Barr rejected a plea deal in the George Floyd killing. So when you're under investigation, when you've been charged with a crime, many of these things can result with a plea deal. You don't actually have to go to a trial. And it sounds like Derek Chauvin wanted a plea deal here, but Attorney General Bill Barr, who was formerly with the Trump administration, said, nope, no deal. Sorry. Here's what happened. He was the Attorney General. He rejected a plea deal days after Mr. Floyd died, worried about the protesters calling it lenient. The plea was for third-degree murder. As soldiers prepared to take to the streets, Derek Chauvin believed that the case against him was so devastating that he agreed to plead guilty to third-degree murder. As part of a deal, officials now say he was willing to go to prison for more than 10 years. Local officials, scrambling to end the community's swelling anger, scheduled a news conference to announce the deal, but at the last minute, according to new details laid out by 3 law enforcement officials, the deal fell apart after William Barr, the Attorney General at the time, rejected the arrangement. The deal was contingent on the federal government approval because Mr. Chauvin asked to serve time in federal prison, where he wanted reassurance that he's not going to face federal civil rights charges. An official said that Bill Barr was worried about a plea deal so early in the process before a full investigation had concluded, probably a good move on that, would be perceived as too lenient by the growing number of protesters. Yeah. At the same time, Barr wanted to allow state officials who were about to take over the case from the county prosecutor who had tense relationships with Minneapolis' black community to make their own decisions about how to proceed. And then lastly, we've got the trial may be yet delayed. The prosecution has asked an appeals court to put off the proceedings, citing the risk that the trial, with so many demonstrators likely to fill the streets, becomes a super spreader event during the coronavirus pandemic. Yeah, I was not expecting this trial to take place next month. This appeal involves a question of exceptional and unique importance in one of the highest profile cases in our nation's history, according to Keith Ellison, the Attorney General. He is leading the prosecution. The state is also appealing a decision by Judge Peter Cahill to separate the trial of Mr. Chauvin, who is charged with second-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. The initial charge of third-degree murder was dropped from the trial of 3 other former officers who were also involved in Floyd's death. 2 of them were rookies with just a few days on the job. The 3 ex-officers who were with Chauvin were Thomas Lane, who held Mr. Floyd's legs, J. Alexander Kung, who was positioned on Mr. Floyd's back, and Tao Thao, who held off angry bystanders. They're scheduled to face trial on aiding and abetting charges in August. And Chauvin's case is scheduled for Monday, March 8th at the Hennepin County Government Center. Do we think that is going to go? No, we do not. Is a trial going to happen on March 8th? I highly, highly doubt it. Typically, these cases can take a lot longer than that. I wouldn't be surprised if we see another year of pretrial proceedings before we actually get to a trial. All right, so let's take a look at some of the questions that we have coming in. Hack Consulting is starting off. Hey, Rob, how are cyberbullying laws in Arizona? Is it possible to ask for a police department to investigate trolls in YouTube chats if they are showing patterns of being malicious? Just asking since, well, perhaps if a mediating government body could intervene online, we could naturally and respectfully ease tensions in the cyber domain. Of course, we do not want swatting. However, we are supposed to rely on the police if there is a society issue in real life, right? So even YouTube will mention this. You know, if you're getting harassed on the internet, YouTube specifically will tell you call the police, right? And that's kind of the standard format, I think, in most states. And it is in Arizona. If you are feeling threatened, if you're feeling dangerous, typically people will reach out to the social media provider, but they're not an enforcement body. You know, they can remove the troll or ban the troll if it breaches their terms of service, but it's law enforcement who's ultimately responsible for it. Now, you know, we've seen situations where law enforcement just goes, well, you know, block them, remove them, go to a different platform, just, you know, get away from that individual. If it is a serious threat, if it's a threat against a government official, yeah, they'll go and investigate the hell out of that. They'll SWAT you if you're threatening the governor, a senator, or anything like that. But if it's just a regular citizen, I've seen the police. It kind of depends on the police department, honestly. It also depends on who you get on the phone, right? You could get an officer on the phone who's bored and wants to look into it, or you get another officer who just says, "You're complaining about that? All right, I got bigger things to worry about." So, you know, it's a good question. Traditionally, the rule is if you feel threatened, if you feel in danger, let the police know and leave it up to them to to sort it out for you. Hack Consulting says, can we say that Hillary has been leading the Dems insurrection and blame 2020 and the Capitol riots on her? Well, Hillary, I saw a tweet from her today, I think it was yesterday, where she was calling any Republicans who voted against conviction of Trump in the impeachment proceedings, she was calling them co-conspirators. That's pretty provocative, isn't it? Does she have evidence of that? Did they co-conspire with Trump? Sounds pretty provocative. Might even be insightful. Hillary, I feel like she's just trying to remain relevant at this point in time. Watching You Daily says, Robert, would you support legislation to limit the impeachment process to the federal rules of court and evidence to include the House process like a grand jury process? I don't know. That's a good question, Watching You Daily. I don't think I have a real opinion on it. I mean, I think that impeachment serves a unique function. So I don't think so. I would think that you would leave those issues to the regular courts as they already exist. So Trump can be sued in civil court. Trump can be sued he can be charged in criminal court. We already have those processes in place. If they want to keep this impeachment stuff going and they want to, use it as a political bludgeon anytime they want to do it, that's fine with me. They can go hog wild in it. It's basically irrelevant as far as I can tell. Trump's not going to get convicted. He didn't get convicted the first time. It's just a political spectacle. And if they want to keep that going in Congress, and that means that they're not out there passing $1.9 trillion spending bills, whatever, right? I'm not particularly bent out of shape about it. If Donald Trump did something that was actually criminal, they should prosecute him for it. And I actually wouldn't be opposed to that. Prosecute him. Let's see this stuff in the court of law. Call that bluff, right? Go do it. If you really think that this was a criminal act, go do it. Go charge him. But they're not going to do it. We have Cax Act says, this is legit the best news show in the world right now. I never pay for channels, but when YouTube demonetized you guys, I subscribed instantly. Please keep your unbiased coverage. Q question. How can we hold the journalists accountable for fake news? Seems they've successfully gamed the system. Well, Cax Axe, I think you're doing it right now. I mean, honestly, the only way I think at this point in time that the main corporate media is going to recognize that they cannot keep just shoving propaganda down everybody's throats is by just turning it off, just going other places. For a long time, the mainstream news has had total control over the distribution channels, which is why they're trying to sever the alternative distribution channels. That's why Parler's going down. That's why Trump was basically deplatformed from everything, because they want to rein back in their distribution pillars. I mean, I think there's 6 companies that own all of the media in this country. And so if anybody like myself or like you, Caxax, if you could just go start a blog, go start a Substack, go over to Patreon, go over to Locals, start a YouTube channel, start a podcast. Well, what are you doing? You are diversifying the distribution channels. They do not like that. That's why you see a lot of this language that, I heard a couple weeks ago when they're talking about reining in the dangerous speech. They got to do something about podcasts. There was some lady on some news channel saying, we got to do something about these podcasts. Anybody can start a podcast and just talk about whatever they want. That's dangerous. And you're going, what? What is that about? They have the monopoly on the distribution channels. They have the CNNs, they have the Foxes, they have the Washington Posts. They own Google and YouTube. They own Facebook. They own Twitter. And so now that you have sort of a decentralization of the content production and the content analysis, that is threatening their monopoly. That's why you have this concerted effort to bring everybody back in under their wing by removing everybody off of the other platforms. And I don't think that is going to be sustainable for them. I think that people are just sick of it. I cut the cord on cable a long time ago, and I mean years and years ago, and I haven't even looked back twice, not once, not even thinking about it. Life's better without listening to the same regurgitated sound bites that are pre-processed for you, so you don't even have to think about it. They just feed them like little pellets down everybody's throats. And it's just, you're going to get tired of it. And so, I would say just forget them, really. I mean, they're basically irrelevant right now. It's copy and paste journalism. There's no actual analysis for most of them. Even the conservative ones, right? They just kind of get out there, hey, you're a great American. You're a great American all day long. Okay, got it. Right? Give us some substance. And as more people start to sort of wake up and realize there are alternative platforms where other people have some insightful thoughts and ideas and good conversations, then the natural consequence of that will be more diversity, more diversification of the media channels, and that's better for all of us. But there is a little bit of a adoption curve. Okay, if you go over to locals right now, there's not that many people on there. More and more are going over there, but it's not anywhere close to a Facebook or a Twitter. But as more and more people sort of say, all right, I'm abandoning ship, I'm out of here, and they find a new platform, things will get better, and they're in big trouble, I think, long term. We have Caxax said, could you cover the Nick Sandmann case at a point? He sued the fake news media. Seems they settled it, but why would he settle if he knew he would win? Well, there's a lot of reasons to settle a case. Candidly, I probably will not cover the Nick Sandmann case. I think those are mostly confidential settlement agreements at this point in time. It was something that was, he was being represented, I think, for some period of time by Linwood, and he was successful. But I think the settlement agreements are confidential, and there are a lot of good reasons to settle a case, right? He may have won in court. He may have lost, though. And so if they gave him a nice, 7-figure settlement, you might just say, all right, listen, you weigh out your risks, the benefits of moving forward versus the risks of moving forward, and probably gave him a deal that was very good. He accepted it and moved on. So, but it is interesting. If something like that happens again, we'll cover the next one. We got Sharon Quidney in the house says, Rob, I heard they were going to try to disqualify Trump from running again on a simple majority. Do you think that could possibly succeed? It sounds completely illegal and unconstitutional to me. So I haven't spent a lot of time on that argument, but I do not think so. I think what the sort of the backup plan is there's several backup plans. One of them, the one I think you're talking about, is this utilization of the 14th Amendment and the incitement of insurrection as basically it's sort of a censure vote that they could pass in both chambers of the houses by a simple majority vote. And then as a part of that censure, they could invoke one of the disqualification clauses from the 14th Amendment that is connected to the insurrection. So there's sort of a domino effect that would happen there. Now, I don't think that is constitutional. I don't think that they would be able to do that. I haven't looked into that argument a whole lot, but just sort of shooting from the hip on that, I don't think that is something that would stand. The other issue that I've seen is, well, what if they prosecute him for that Raffensperger phone call? We now know that there's a Democratic newly elected person out of Fulton County in Georgia who is investigating Trump for that phone call. We went through this on yesterday's show where there's 3 different charges that they think might stick. I don't think that they will. And they are, but theoretically, if you got him convicted of a felony, then I think you could make an argument that he couldn't run again because he's sort of a felon now, and he probably would have a difficult time getting on ballots in some states. But I still think even as a felon, you've got a constitutional argument that you can still run for office. So I think what you're hearing about in terms of trying to disqualify him is a lot of self-indulgent talk because they know that they're going to lose the conviction part of the impeachment proceedings. Liberty or Death says, you support an Article 5 convention. Yes, I would like to see the repeal of the 17th Amendment institution of term limits for no more than 2 terms for senators, 6 for congressmen. So that would be 12 years and 12 years. SCOTUS, other Article 3 judges should be limited to 25 years for starters. Lightbulb, we had an impeachment party. Let's do an Article 5 party. Could be fun. Yeah, so he's talking about a convention of the states, a constitutional convention. And I do support that. I think that would be outstanding. In fact, one of the forums, one of the venues that I think would be appropriate to introduce the digital Bill of Rights that we're working on, which we're going to have our second workshop on Saturday at 5 p.m. Arizona time. That'll be 7 p.m. Eastern time. That is, I think, the appropriate venue to introduce that. So the digital Bill of Rights. I like the Article 5 party. I think right now I like your term limits. I like the term limits for the judges, for the Congress people. I want to stay focused on the digital Bill of Rights. I think that would be something that we could introduce at the Article 5 party for sure. Farmer's Daughter says, Robert, I had to laugh when Senator Lee stood up and told Raskin it was an outright lie. He withdrew it because it was a lie, but with the option to reintroduce it. LOL, it was a lie. So I didn't see that part specifically, but I did saw the news. I mean, the whole thing is just like, it's like a clown show. We have Hack says, so repeat offenders that got the maximum penalty weren't beaten hard enough to deter them. How hard must we beat them so that the next generation looks back and says, hey, it was a great decision they made to destroy the lives of innocent people. Now can I have another $400 and a piece of bread, please? Yeah. Scary thought that might be a reality. We got Jeremy Matrita says, this message, the message Congress is sending to the world is how incompetent they are. You can't charge someone with inciting violence and then try to convict them for something else during the trial. Right. Yeah. I mean, it's exactly right. They were claiming he did something, and then once they got that into court, the whole argument changed about how bad everything was without really, in my opinion, proving that he was the ultimate cause of it. We have Liberty or Death says, isn't it interesting that congressmen can read into the Constitution the right to health care, but the whole freedom of speech and the right to bear arms thing, what is that? My question is, if health care is constitutional right, when do I get my free gun? Yeah, it's a good point, right? I mean, the federal government just gets bigger and bigger and bigger every year, and the fundamental rights that are established in the Bill of Rights seem to get smaller and smaller and smaller. Why is that? I don't know. It's something that I think is horrendous, right? And that's why part of the reason why I'm so passionate about this show is because those issues, I think we need to push back on those issues from time to time. When the bureaucracy is squeezing those important fundamental rights away from you, you gotta just flex a little bit and push out that bubble and make sure peacefully that they know that there will be ramifications from taking away our rights that are in the Bill of Rights, and they're there for a reason. We have Paula MK says, the important question is, now that you've reached 100K subscribers, when is Miss Faith joining the broadcast? Well, Paula MK, we were talking about that today. We're trying to figure out when that's going to be. It's going to be her big debut, Miss Faith, right back there. We're talking about you, Faith. And, she's going to come on. I think it's going to be Monday. So we've got our office is actually closed on Monday for President's Day. But this show must go on. Okay. We don't miss shows here if I can help it. So we'll be back on Monday. And then tomorrow, we were going to do it tomorrow, but she's got a prior obligation. So I think tomorrow is not going to be in the equation. But I told her, I said, hey, make him wait just a little bit. All right. This is the big event. Make him wait, make him want it, make him feel it. So she'll be coming on here. She's excited about it. She's got some other projects and things that I think I'm going to ask her to share with you if she's comfortable with that, because we want to support her for all the tremendous work that she does. Miss Faith will be making an appearance probably next week, early next week. We have Liberty or Death says, I would spend maybe 5 seconds on the video to stress that it was no proof of anything wrong by President Trump, then move on. In court, would never be allowed because those videos are obviously more prejudicial than probative. Yeah, so I think Liberty is talking about the defense that Trump and his team are going to be presenting tomorrow, right? Yeah, I mean, less is more, I think, honestly. I think that less is more tomorrow. You come out there, you make your bullet points. You know that the senators aren't going to convict him, so stop wasting everybody's time. You walk out of there with a win. You don't need to go in there and just beat this thing to death with fraud, and stolen. You don't need to do any of that stuff. Close it out. Move on to the next one. We got Croc 1 Alpha says, Vale, Brian Sicknick, but are they sure it wasn't COVID? We don't know. I mean, it kind of has some of the same symptoms of COVID. I mean, to be perfectly serious with you here. Right? There was a lot of evidence of people stroking out from COVID. It was sort of one of those, like a silent killer. Once you got over, my family was in the hospital. My brother was in the hospital for 48 days. They were telling us he was going to stroke out or have a heart attack because you get the cytokine storm in your brain and you just sort of stroke out, especially when your enzyme levels and everything is going up in your body. I mean, they told us that was going to happen a number of times. Thank God it did not. But yeah, I mean, he had a blood clot and a brain stroke, right? I don't know. I hope his family's doing okay. You know, we certainly don't. We don't want people dying. Just too many people dying right now. Paula MK says, Robert, I received a text message from the Illinois Network for Pretrial Justice seeking to get my vote on a bill that would stop people from being jailed because they can't afford bail. I know you were in favor of this, but my question is, if there's no bail agreement, how are defendants held accountable to show up for court? Good question, Paula MK. This is a good question. And, you know, I'm sort of open for debate on this issue. I know a lot of criminal defense attorneys are just automatically, eliminate cash bail. Basically what that means. So if let's say you get arrested for a domestic violence offense and you see a judge, the judge might say, okay, well, I still think you're a danger to the community, so I'm not going to let you out of custody. Okay, there's no release. Right now, in most states, in most situations, that's not allowed, especially if it's a first-time offense. So what a judge will do is they'll say, okay, look, I'm going to let you out, but you got to post $500 in order to come back to court. It's going to secure your appearance. If you don't come back, we're going to keep the $500. If you do come back and your case is closed at the disposition, at the final end of the case, whether you're innocent or if you found guilty, we can apply that $500 to your fine, or we can give you the $500 back. Right, and so the major harm here is that a lot of people who are very poor, they don't have $500 to get out of custody. So they'll just sit in custody for months, right? Or the way that this is being exploited is you'll have somebody who's poor, who doesn't have any money, who gets caught up in something, who actually didn't do anything wrong. And a prosecutor will say, well, I can let you out today. All you have to do is just sign this plea deal and just agree that you're guilty. And then they do that and they get out of custody. And if they don't sign that plea deal, well, you got to post a $500. Well, I don't have $500. Okay, well, if you're not going to sign this plea deal, then you got to sit in custody until your next pretrial conference in 45 days. And the person goes, I can't sit in custody for 45 days. I got a job to be at tomorrow. So they sign the document. So it's overly, prejudicial. It's a high burden. And so that's a problem. Now, I think in some places where they have tried just eliminating bail entirely, people just don't show back up to court. I think this was taking place in New York. And so I'm open to sort of ideas on this. I certainly don't think that, I think there's a lot of room for reform. I just haven't settled on what that looks like. I think that in certain situations, a cash bond requirement might be appropriate, but you can maybe have some that are more cognizant of a person's income level, right? Why would somebody who's a multimillionaire have a $500 bond, but somebody who makes $30,000 a year have a $500 bond? Maybe you would tie it to their income level, or, judges just have some more freedom to say, okay, well, we'll let you out, but you gotta, comply with a new text program, or you gotta, download this app that tracks where you are. You gotta check in once a day, or you gotta wear an ankle monitor, or you gotta, have somebody come into court and sign a document saying that they're going to vouch for you, or put this up as collateral. Give us, there's a lot of other alternatives that you can do to secure somebody coming back to court. Doesn't necessarily have to be the money. And so, there are a lot of proposals flying around about that, but I would check out specifically what they're doing in Illinois, see how that sounds now that I've sort of fleshed out some of those issues. Maybe their proposal will ring the bell for you. Croc1 Alpha says, shouldn't the police have medical examiners report confirming the cause of death before homicide charges are laid on anyone? Until then, wouldn't any allegation only be some sort of assault with intent or grievous bodily harm? Yeah. And that's probably a big reason why we have not seen charges. So I think there's probably two issues going on. One, cause of death. As you mentioned, they don't really know what the cause of death is. And probably number two, since they don't know what the cause of death is, they probably don't have an actual person who's responsible for it, because you kind of work backwards, right? If he would have gone to the hospital with a legitimate gash in his head that looked like it would have come from a fire extinguisher, well, you work backwards. All right, he's got a gash in his head. He's bleeding. All right, let's look at the footage. Okay, somebody threw a fire extinguisher. Who was that person? Go find that person and review all of the different video footage and security footage to figure out who that person was. But if they can't identify the cause of it, if he just was done for the day and just, dropped down with a blood clot, taken to the hospital, and they can't really explain where that came from, then what they're doing is just speculating at that point. And it's going to be really hard to tie any particular protester or rioter or insurrectionist, however you want to define them, back to that cause of death, which is probably why they can't make their case right now. Hack Consulting says, yeah, public interest is strong in favor of releasing the autopsy report. However, I refuse to force them to. Privacy of Brian and his family, dignity of the deceased and afflicted. Same with those trying to bludgeon others with his death as a political weapon. Have some dignity, Democrats. That's a good take on it. I can appreciate those values and the dignity and the sanctity of the family. I do think that there are some pretty strong interests here for the public to know, and especially if they charge an individual with that crime, that absolutely has to be disclosed to the defense, right? I appreciate your sentiments here, Hack Consulting, but if I were a defendant and I'm a criminal defense attorney representing a defendant, I would want to make sure that I had that document. Absolutely. I have my own experts take a look at it, and we would mount a defense around that. So it's pretty important stuff. We got Liberty or Death says, have you represented alleged bad popo before? So I have, actually. We've represented a couple different bad popos. Quote, bad popos. Look, when I say bad popo, I'm having fun with it. I don't truly think that every single officer is a bad officer, right? They're all people just like you and I. They're going to make mistakes just like you and I. And I think that they also deserve representation. Absolutely. They deserve a criminal defense just like any other person in this country does. I'm an equal opportunity defense attorney for everybody. And I know sometimes that may seem sort of hypocritical, or that may seem like, well, but they're kind of your enemy and you're working with them. It's like, nope, folks, the standard here is due process, the Constitution, your right to the presumption of innocence unless proven otherwise. And I adhere to that above everything else. I'm not going to get into the weeds about, well, that person is really bad or that person is really guilty. If they need a defense, and I think we can add value to them, and we can work out, an arrangement in order to do that, I'll do it. We've got another one from Paula MK says, I just want to sit down with some of these absurd reps and senators for like 10 minutes so they can look me in the eye and try to tell me they, quote, work for the people. That would be a funny conversation. Yeah, I think you should live stream that if you ever get that done. I would love to see what they say to that, because they work for themselves. Come on, they work for themselves. We all know that. Farmer's Daughter says, what is your opinion of the Dems using the 3 people who died of natural causes and the 2 subsequent police suicides? I believe I heard that none of the 3 entered the Capitol. The 2 suicides, as tragic as they are, happened later. So I think that I think it is inappropriate to use death for political means, for political momentum. And I think that they got pretty close to that. Certainly, look, there are going to be deaths in the country, deaths in this world. And you have to talk about that because they naturally and consequently impact policy, right? This impacted policy pretty clearly. But if you're going to be bending the facts a little bit, right? The suicides, yeah, I don't, who knows what happened there. And I've talked about that. I really don't like the idea that happened. And I want to support law enforcement. I want to support everybody who is in a mental position where they think that taking their life is the best option. It's the only way out. It's horrible. There's a lot of that going on right now. I just read another headline. Some 12-year-old kid did that to himself because of the stress that he's facing from not going to school and lockdown life. So I want more resources. I want less suicides. I'm very passionate about that. And, I do what I can to help in that arena. But when you start to jump on a bandwagon, when you say Brian Sicknick was murdered by the rioters, and then suddenly we fast forward a month and there's no evidence of that. That's malpractice, in my opinion. That's journalistic malpractice for the Democrats to seize on that. In my opinion, and the family, the Sicknick family, they're ultimately the ones that matter. My opinion on their loss is irrelevant, in my opinion. Their opinion on their own loss is important. But if I were in their shoes and somebody was trying to take, basically grift off of my brother's death for their political gains, I would be furious about that. Furious. And it's because it's not the truth, right? The truth, I think, would be important to get out there, but this is so political at this point in time. It's hard to keep anything together, and they're just running with it. We got Ned Arb Lasser says, I keep hearing these, quote, what happened on January 6th is the worst since the British, blah, blah, blah. What about the 7 people who were arrested and charged with setting off a time bomb in the U.S. Capitol in 1983? Bill Clinton actually pardoned one of them, Susan Rosenberg, who now sits on the board for 1,000 Currents fundraiser for BLM. Maybe that's why they keep forgetting about it. It's just political hyperbole. I mean, I've heard that this was like Rwanda, where like 1 million people died, if not more than that. I think Chuck Schumer called it like Pearl Harbor, where we had several thousand people killed and launched us into a war. It's just political hyperbole. So you just got to, look at it through that lens. A lot of hyperventilating about the Capitol Hill stuff. Just can't even catch your breath. It's so atrocious. All right, we got it. Calm down. It's going to be okay. We're going to get through this. They're going to arrest a bunch of people. Look around the country. They're already doing it. Calm down. Okay, relax. Count to 10, and we'll move on. Hack Consulting says, I don't want impeachment limited except by precedent. This is a tradition we need to leave as open as possible for posterity. Yeah, I think I'm kind of in that boat. Yeah, leave it open. Do whatever they want to do. I don't care. whatever they want to do. Impeach everybody for all I care. We've got Jax842 says, I've been watching you for a while, but I've never participated in the conversation. I just wanted to piggyback on everyone who thanks you for your content. Obviously, you are awesome. Well, I think you're awesome, Jax, and I appreciate it. And I would encourage you to participate. You know, it's kind of fun to get in there and mix it up a little bit. Everybody's very friendly, especially on locals. I'm grateful that you're here. Thank you for your support, and thanks for chiming in. Thanks for joining in on the chat. Hack says, is there any public prosecutors that we can work with, like in the sense that we get a public defender as a right? Obviously, we shouldn't be prosecuting everything for free. Having some incentive to prosecute in the form of private practice helps get amazing lawyers. So there are actually, they're kind of called contract prosecutors. So in Arizona, we have some small towns that don't really have enough of a caseload to warrant a full-time prosecutor. And so what they'll do is they'll actually hire defense attorneys to come in there and prosecute, or other lawyers as prosecutors. So they'll say, we have one city here in Arizona where I think they have court 1 day a week, maybe 2 days a week. And it's a private attorney who is the prosecutor, and they just have a contract and they go in there. And I got to be honest, they are the best to work with, the best, because they just go, what? The cop arrested him for what? And I go, I know, it's ridiculous. And they go, yeah, you're right. Then they say, what are you going to do with this case? And I said, I'm going to file this motion, and we're going to submit this deviation, and we're going to take it to trial. And they go, no, you're not. This is stupid. I'm going to go ahead and dismiss it. Thanks. And go, perfect. That's exactly the right thing. This is justice. Thank you for doing it and making it easy. In some of the other courts where you're dealing with these just, bureaucratic prosecutors who are working their way up the chain. They're on the 10-year plan. They're going to be the head of a bureau division. I'm going to be the head of vehicular crimes. All right, good for you. All right, so how about this? And you try to negotiate with them and they say, nope, policy is this. They're like good little foot soldiers, just implementing the policy that have been dictated by the bureaucracy, and they're very difficult to work with. Even in cases where you're like, look, I have a legitimate legal issue here. This officer screwed this up. He shouldn't have done that. Violated this right and that right. And they just go, well, I trust my officers, sir, and I'm not going to allow you to sit here and impugn them. All right, fine. We'll take it to a jury then. So there are alternative solutions on that. Now, typically, most prosecutors are part of a bigger bureaucracy. They're big, hundreds of attorneys, especially here in Maricopa County. I think the fifth biggest county in the country. So they have a lot of resources there, a lot of bodies in the prosecutor's office. Hack Consulting says, I totally agree that the defense needs to know in a court of law where it is not supposed to be filmed, like with Trump's tax returns, investigate them confidentially. The public does not need to know everything, whether it is classified, private, or even current strategies. So I understand your perspective. I am somebody who I can understand your perspective on that. I typically like more transparency. Right? That's just kind of my nature, though. But I understand your perspective. And our last one of the day comes from Ugly Douglin. Says, does Trump have a chance during this trial to bring up the Time article that says a well-funded cabal of powerful people helped, quote, fortify the elections, and then use that as a way to bring up his election evidence? Even if he cannot become president at this point, maybe it'll wake some people up. So Ugly Douglin, yeah, I mean, he does. He has the ability to do that. I think it would be a mistake. I do not think that is a good strategy. And I think a lot of other people are actually in agreement with that. I think Alan Dershowitz said today that he thinks that would be a trap. And I agree with him totally. I've made this point before on the show. You can either win or you can be right. That's something that a lot of the time you have to acknowledge in law and in life. Sometimes you just have to just say, all right, I got to win this, and I'm not going to be right about it. So in other words, rather than presenting everything that you think makes you right, you just leave all of that in the drawer. You just pick out that one little tool that will get you to the victory, because if you want to be right and cram all of that in the other side's face, then you're not going to win. You're going to be right. You're going to feel good about it. So in this case, Donald Trump could come in and say, look at the Time magazine and look at Matt Brainard and look at all these, these different lawsuits, and we've got all this evidence. And it would just rile up the other senators, and they would say, look, Trump is relitigating something that we don't want to talk about. He just angered all of our constituencies. We have to go and convict him now because we can't have this conversation hanging over our heads for the next 4 years. So they vote to convict him. So he would be right. He might wake a lot of people up, might be something very persuasive for a lot of the American people, might be better for the country, right? For investigating whatever. You can make that argument. But he'd probably lose. And I don't think he's going to do that. Trump likes to make make a big show of things, but even he knows when to remain quiet when it is serving his strategic advantages. And that's exactly what's happening here. Good question, though, Uckley Douglin. And if you did not already notice, those questions were coming over from our platform on Locals, locals.com/watchingthewatchers, or this address, watchingthewatchers.locals.com. And I want to thank these awesome people who support us over there. We got Jason Segal, we've got Steve-O 9300, we have Dr. Guns, we got Loxton over there, we got Jen McClellan, Saline Sal, we've got Sabo Abbas, who we see regularly, we've got XN Drew, we got Keith C3, we have Savdi, Realtor Patty 14, CP Miller VW, we got Clock Doc in the house, Tis-I, C the Rhine, and then we got a couple people who signed up late last night in between today. Want to thank Peg J, P-E-G-G-J, so Peg J. We've got Dev613 who just signed up, and we got Jax842 who all signed up last night. Thank you to all of you who have done so. Others, 111 Patriot, we got Joe's No, we got SF Bob. Somebody signed up with RR Law Group. That's fun. We got See the Veil was in the house today, Kenny B1B, and many others. And everybody, thank you so much for going over there and joining up on that separate platform. I know it's a little bit of an ask. You know, you're on YouTube, you're on Facebook, and to say, hey, go download this new app and go join a new platform, because there are so many of them out there. But what we're trying to do is build a little bit of a community that is a little bit more eternal, that is a nice stake in the ground that we can all just kind of rely on. Just, go back there. Locals, I think, is, I really appreciate their mission. I appreciate a lot of the other creators and other people who are on their platform. So I think it's got some serious staying power. And right now what we're doing is we're helping to build the next version of conversation. And so for you to go over there and be a part of building that foundation is just, it's invaluable, truthfully. It's necessary. We need to create a hub that has a little bit of a network effect so that other people want to go and be a part of it. And by you signing up and joining up over there, you are a part of that solution. So thank you sincerely for that. If you have not gone over there, well, you should, because there's a lot of cool things happening there. You can get a copy of my book, of course. It's called Beginning to Winning: How to Fight Your Case and Succeed in the Criminal Justice System. There's a free PDF over on Locals. You can also download a copy of today's slides. The slides have the sources in them, most of them. Sometimes I forget to put them in there, but you can figure it out. So you can get those slides. You can get a copy of the impeachment template. We're basically at the end of that. So that's going to be not so relevant anymore. But if you want to download that document, feel free to do that. Get a copy of my existence system. It's a personal productivity little tool that I put together. These are PowerPoint slides. You can download them and modify them for free. If you want to figure out how I learn them, go take a look at my video from January 1st, 2021, where I explain exactly how I use it. Also, links and good conversation over there. But the real reason to be on Locals is the great people. All the questions that we took today came from Locals. A lot of good conversation there. Mr. Ma posted over there, I just saw before the show, a nice congratulation on the channel that he has helped us moderate and grow. And so thank you to Ma. Thank you to Miss Faith for helping us get there. We just crossed 100,000 subscribers. Oh my goodness. I'm like blown away by it. I mean, I looked at the numbers today and I just I'm still trying to process it. I was telling Miss Faith, I said, hey, make sure that YouTube delivers my Lamborghini soon, right? I don't want to wait long. Okay. Send it over here. I want a black one, by the way, a black Lambo. If it's a red Lambo, I'm sending it back. If it's a yellow Lambo, definitely sending it back. If it's a 2020 Lambo, I don't want it. I want a 2021 Lambo, and it's got to be black, baby. So I'm just joking, obviously, right? We got demonetized. We're not getting Lambos anytime soon. So we're having fun, though. And it's been a wild ride. We've grown quickly. And I want to thank all of you really from the bottom of my heart. I'm having a lot of fun. I'm learning a lot. I appreciate all of the support. I'm very grateful that we've been able to sort of create this relationship that we have. And I'm looking forward to seeing it continue to grow for the foreseeable future. So that's it for the program today. One more reminder, I'm a criminal defense lawyer. Not going to go into my whole spiel, but if you know anybody in the state of Arizona who needs help with criminal charges, that's exactly what we do here. We're very good at it. So that's it for the program. I want to thank you so much again for being here. We'll be back here same time, same place tomorrow. It's going to be at 5 p.m. Arizona time, 4 p.m. in California on the West Coast, 6 p.m. Central time out there in Texas, 7 p.m. on the East Coast. And for those Florida man out there, everybody sleep very well tonight. Have a wonderful evening. I'll see you right back here tomorrow. Bye-bye.